In this video, we're going to be taking a look at XCP-NG, a Type 1 hypervisor, and evaluating it specifically for use in classrooms and home labs. There's a lot of different hypervisors out there, and they're good for different things. For example, VMware ESXi is probably the most popular hypervisor used in enterprise clusters and something that you're likely to run into if you're a professional sysadmin. Its little brother VMware Workstation, used a lot by hobbyists, students, some developers for spinning up a quick environment on a Windows machine. Proxmox PVE, based on Debian, it's best suited typically for home labbers who want full features with no license fees and easy built-in access to turnkey container installation. There's also Oracle VirtualBox, which is nice cross-platform hypervisor for simple home projects where you want to host more than one VM and you don't feel like paying for the privilege. There's also Hyper-V for people who hate themselves and for companies who think that it's a good deal. And there's a lot more past that. KVM, Xen, Red Hat, EV, OpenVZ, QEMU, the list just goes on. There's really too many hypervisors to cover in a typical undergrad course, or for that matter, for quick research by a home labber who just wants to pick a hypervisor to put on his host. For example, in a course that I took covering infrastructure services, we only really had time to go into depth on VMware ESXi and Proxmox VE, plus maybe some incidental study of VMware Workstation, just so we can have an environment to install the other hypervisors into. However, I knew there were all these other choices out there, and even discounting stuff like alpha stage projects that may never get completed, or the abandoned hypervisors of yesteryear, someone is still using them for the most part. And there must be a reason for this, and so it makes sense that looking into other hypervisors might be a worthwhile use of our time. As I said at the top, here we're going to be looking at XCP-NG as a potential hypervisor for study and home use, evaluating it in those environments based on the rough requirements of the course that I was in. Now, let's just be upfront with this. I am not an expert on XCP-NG, and I'm not an expert in virtualization in general. I did some self-studying, taken some formal classes, and I'm mostly familiar with VMware ESXi, but also to a lesser extent with some of the others like VMware Workstation, Proxmox VE, VirtualBox, and QEMU. Now, specifically because I'm not an expert on XCP-NG, I'm going to be detailing not only the installation process and the features that we're going to be finding, but also the gotchas and the potholes that I ran into on my road to installation and configuration, both specifically for this video and during the dry runs that I did before this video. So in this video, I'm going to be installing several instances of the XCP-NG hypervisor in VMs on my home server. Now, my home server happens to be running ESXi 6.7U2 specifically, and that means that the procedures that I follow may have to be changed if you're using bare metal or a different nesting hypervisor. As far as networking goes, I'm leaving the installed hypervisors on my normal home network subnet just to minimize the potential points of failure. But if this is something that you want to run over a longer period of time or leave these hypervisors running, you want to segregate them from your home or lab networks, absolutely do that and run them under a different subnet. Or if you have a server like this, just throw a simple virtual router into a VM and then create access lists to isolate this lab from your home network if you want. I'll take a look at some of the basic features of the XCP-NG hypervisor and confirm that they work from the command line. I'll install the Xen Orchestra control software in a VM on one of the XCP-NG hosts, and we'll take a look at its capabilities and limitations. And then I'll do some things that you would expect to do with multiple enterprise-ready hypervisors, like cluster them together, install a VM, migrate it around, you know the drill. And then I'm specifically going to be looking at some of the shortcomings that I've found of Xen Orchestra and XCP-NG in these environments, including what I consider to be a critical flaw for users like myself and something to strongly consider when looking for a home lab hypervisor. Spoiler alert, XCP-NG is probably not the right hypervisor to pick if you use turnkey VMs or pre-configured deployables like the GNS3 VM. So here's a bit of my hypervisor. I already have 3 of them that I was using while learning this project and doing a paper beforehand. I'm going to go ahead and delete them so I can start from scratch. So I'm going to build a brand new VM to host this in. I'll just give it a name that makes sense to me. For now, I'll just set it up as Linux Other 4.x 64-bit, and that'll work just fine. I'm going to give it 4 virtual CPUs. You can go as low as 2. Theoretically, you can go as low as 1, but I would not, and I'll explain that later. Now, here's something that really frustrated me for a couple of days when I first started this project. Do not turn on IOMMU in your virtual machine settings. I don't know why. It's not really clearly explained anywhere. I found this after 2 days of troubleshooting why my installation kept crashing. Do not turn on IOMMU. In memory right now, I'm going to set it at 8 gigs. You can set it as low as 2. I would recommend no less than 4. And for hard drive, I'm going to set it to 200 gigs. You can set it as low as 60, I think is the stated minimum. I have built this at 50, but I would not try that, and I'm setting this to 200 to leave enough room for the basic VMs that I'm going to need. And also, if you, like me, like to set your VMs as thin provisioned, this is a case where you should not. Set it as thick provisioned. And the reason is that you're nesting a hypervisor inside another hypervisor, and once you start going thin, all inside of each other, everything's going to slow down to a crawl. And then I make sure my network is set up on the correct vSwitch, and then I'll go looking for the ISO to connect. You can see here that I have 2 different XCP-ng ISOs. I have the net installer, which is the smaller one, and I have the more complete installer. I'm just going to go with the net installer because, first of all, it's smaller, and second, I prefer just grabbing the more up-to-date packages first time through instead of writing old packages and then overwriting them for no reason. And then I'm going to leave everything else as is, check my options, and my VM is ready to go. So in this case, we're booting from the ISO image using a BIOS boot. This is pretty much what it looks like. One thing you're going to have to get used to, I don't know why exactly this is the case, but there are many times in the installation, booting, and update processes where XCP-ng just sits there and you think that nothing is happening, like for minutes on end. Just be patient, let it go through. I don't know why it's designed this way, but unless you have done something like exposed the CPUs to IOMMU or not given enough resources, it will eventually take off again. And speaking of resources, what I mentioned before about not going for less than 2 CPUs, that is so that all of your XCP-ng instances, even in a small lab setting, will have enough resources to run the Xen Orchestra virtual machine, which you may want to move around between different hypervisors. And from here, our installation process is pretty much like most distributions installation processes. You might find that your arrow keys don't really work. You'll just have to use tab a lot. Tab and enter are your friends through these. So this one is a little bit unclear. They ask you if you want to use LVM or ext. LVM is the default file system. ext, they don't really specify which version of ext. I'm going to assume it's ext4, although I'm not sure about that. One thing that they don't make really clear is whether or not you can change the provisioning type per VM, like you can on most other hypervisors. I did look into this a little bit. There does not seem to be a way to flip back and forth within the same storage system to go between thin and thick provisioning. I think in LVM it's just not possible to do thin provisioning at all, and it seems like if you choose ext, then you're always thin provisioning. It's very strange, but I'm going with ext. Now keep in mind that once you have an XCP-ng instance, you can choose other kinds of storage types. For, let's say, you have a storage repository or a VDI that you want to attach, and it does apparently support systems like NFS, ZFS, Gluster, XFS, and they all have different characteristics under XCP-ng. But for now, we'll just deal with these two. And on this screen, you want to do your network setup IO. Of course, we'll always recommend that you choose static because you're going to have to find these hosts after the fact, and in order to do things like cluster them together, don't ever use DHCP for servers in general is my recommendation. We're not using a VLAN because we don't have our network set up that way, but you may need to. Now here, when you're choosing the URL, you can just leave that alone. You don't need username or password. It asks you if you want to verify files in the repository. I'm going to choose yes. This just checks various sums and hashes to make sure that the files that you're grabbing are actually the files that you want and not something that somebody has thrown in there that might be malicious. This takes quite a while, so if you choose this, just realize that you may as well walk away for a little bit. Now once you go through that, the installer is going to ask you for your root password. I'm not a really big fan of this. I personally think it's much more secure to not have a root password and simply add users to the sudoers file, but this is how it works, so let's just go ahead with it. And then for some reason, we get yet another prompt to define our networking. Fortunately, our values are filled in. I don't know why this happens, but now it continues and asks us for a DNS configuration, which I'm pretty sure we did last time too, but the installer just seems kind of hinky once in a while. When you select your time zone, there is an America entry, but there's also a US entry, and since I'm in the United States, that's what I'll use. Choose your time zone, and then of course I'm just going to use public NTP servers. If you have an on-network NTP server, use that. And now we go through the installation process. This again can take a very long time with large pauses where it seems like nothing is happening. So go ahead and get yourself a drink or something, and we'll pop back here once we're done. Now, after a very long installation process, it'll come up with this question of whether or not you would like to install any supplemental packs. I'm going to caution you here and just recommend that you say no for now. And the reason is that early on when I was trying to install XCP-NG for doing some proof of concept instances, anytime that I selected supplemental packs, it would just start looping and cause my install to fail, and I had to start all over again. So for now, we'll just say no. And after this question, there is an unnecessarily long completing installation segment. Now, what I did at this time, completing installation stuck on 44% for a very long time. We're talking minutes and minutes, and then it went to 48% and stayed there for a very long time, and I was afraid that maybe my installation had been hosed. But I just walked away and let it go, came back 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, and it was finally done. And finally, after a reboot, we get up to this semi-attractive looking two-tone configuration window, which is your default admin window for XCP-NG. So that was quite tedious, but not really all that difficult if you know all the pitfalls along the way. I'm going to create another VM just like that one on a slightly different IP address, and I'll be right back when I have both of them up and running. Alright, now we have the two consoles of the two XCP-NG instances up next to each other. You can see that one is at .70, the other one's at .71. Just kind of arrow keying through these options, you can see that pretty much you get everything that you need, just about, to manage a pool or just a host on XCP-NG. As soon as you install it, of course, you need either console access or shell access in order to see it. There's a couple other ways that you can control XCP-NG, but first let's just take a look at the command shell. Of course, here we are going to log in as root. I think I've already mentioned I don't like this from a security perspective, but you know, that's how they do it, so we're just going to roll with it. Here you're logged in as root. XCP-NG is based on CentOS. I'm not sure if that's going to change in the future, since Red Hat is doing some strange things with CentOS. But there you can see the uname, so you have all your standard Red Hat style Linux commands available. There are a couple of times that you do have to use those commands in order to change configuration files, but not too often. Now, once you're in the XCP-NG command shell, you also get access to the XE series of commands. As you can see there, I just typed XE help. That gives me a brief list of available commands there. And these are also commands that you can use to manage your host or your pool. It's pretty comprehensive. There's a long list of shell commands available in the XCP-NG documentation. You can read through that if you really want to. Personally, not a huge fan of doing this to manage a hypervisor, but some people are. You have the option available. We just take a look at a couple of the more basic commands. Here's a VM list. We don't really have any VMs running, and the command output is going to reflect that. We can also take a look at the CD list. By default, you get guesttools.iso, which installs something which is similar to VM tools, but for XE, obviously. You can get a little more details on our network parameters. There's a lot available in XE, but the tool that most people like to use to manage Xen-type hypervisors is Xen Orchestra, which we're going to go take a look at. There are several ways, again, that you can install this. You can install manually from source. You can download an appliance. Installing from source does give you all the features. You can also just do this quick deploy, which is web-based, extremely simple. That's what we're going to do right now. This deploys directly from a web browser. It actually links back to your XCP-ng instance, which has this web server up, and it does all the work for you. Now, if you do this, you're probably going to have to accept self-signed certificates, unless you actually set up a signed certificate beforehand. We didn't, so we're going to have to choose this option. So this is the simplest way to install it. One disadvantage of doing it this way is that you don't have all of the tools available with Xen Orchestra enabled by default. It will give you a paywall. This particular installation of Xen Orchestra is meant to be used in an enterprise deployment where people are paying licenses for support. If you are really interested in using Xen Orchestra, I would strongly advise that you build from source. That's a little outside of our scope today, so we won't be looking at that. And if you already know how to build from source, you're probably going to go there anyway just because you can. But instead, let's just do the quick deploy. Again, this is going to sit there and take a while where it seems like it's doing absolutely nothing. Now, after I completed my install, I got this little pop-up that said XOA is not responding. I think this is just an erroneous message, so you can get past this. Let's go back to our shell admin windows and take a look to see if that VM is actually in there and running. So to do that, we're going to jump into the command shell, and we're going to type XE space VM -list. And there we see that, yes, the XOA VM is apparently present, and it is running on this server. So we should be okay. Yes, it's running according to the attractive two-tone admin window. So let's just go take a look at the IP address that we've assigned to Xen Orchestra. And there we see a sign-in. We'll just enter the credentials that we put in before. Mine aren't very interesting. So now we're inside the Xen Orchestra window. We can see the only VM that it has assigned is the XO VM itself. So let's take a look. You're going to get a lot of these weird errors and such when you first start up Xen Orchestra. A lot of them have to do with not having a subscription. Some of them just have to do with reporting hasn't caught up to the UI yet. Now, during my various installs of this, Xen Orchestra was a little inconsistent when determining whether or not it required me to be registered on the Xen Orchestra website in order to get updates. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It was pretty annoying, and really it's kind of another argument to maybe just build from source and deal with the updates manually. The dashboard in Xen Orchestra is not really as detailed as I would like, and it's certainly not as detailed as, say, the free version of ESXi. But if we go to the dashboard all the way down, there's a section here for updating. It shows that we're missing 34 patches, and it will allow us to get them. A lot of times in Xen Orchestra, like many other UIs, there are several ways to accomplish the same task, in this case, getting updates. And most of them don't work, but this one does. I know I said before that Xen Orchestra is not very friendly when it comes to importing a pre-configured VM. As you can see here, there is a way to import them. You can import an OVA or an XVA file. XVA is the Xen specific type. OVA, if I recall correctly, is specifically for Oracle VirtualBox. There's no option here for converting from a VMware appliance, so there are some guides on how to do that. I personally don't like to do that because I wind up with a lot of artifacts, and so many times it's easier just to build the VM from scratch. But as I pointed out before, the most common VM that I'm installing is the GNS3 VM, and it does not play nice with Xen Orchestra, and officially it's not supported. So over here in the settings, what we're going to do is add the address of our second host for XCP-NG, and this will allow us to connect and administer it. Now, we're going to be joining these into a pool, but just so you're aware, Xen Orchestra is designed to handle very large multi-pool installations. So let's say you have a pool of hosts sitting in one data center, you have a pool of hosts sitting in another data center, pool of hosts sitting in another data center. Maybe you have a distributed pool where several hosts are connected together into a single resource pool. Xen Orchestra is designed to handle all of those in one interface, which is actually very nice if you're dealing with large distributed infrastructures. So as you can see here, our two hosts are currently in two different pools. They're auto-assigned XCP-NG 1 and 2. And if we look a little deeper into these pools, we can see, once again, we have 14 missing patches on XCP-NG2. We're going to have to take care of that before we can transfer that server out of there and into a single pool. So we have to go through this unholy nightmare of patching again. Again, the patching process is not very informative. How far along are you? When will you be done? Who knows? Anyway, eventually you will get done patching, and here's a fun part. In order to apply these patches, you're going to have to reboot both of these servers. Of course, one of them is hosting the very appliance that you're on right now. And because you're hosting the XOA VM on it, you can't actually reboot it from XOA. So we're going to have to jump back into that sudo DOS window, the command line interface, and reboot it from there. And then we'll restart the XOA appliance when both of these come back up. Okay, we jumped a little bit ahead, and now you can see that host number 2 is up and running. There's not much interesting to look at there, but host number 1 is still in the process of booting, and that is going to take a while. But once it's done, we want to take a look from this menu to see the list of local VMs, and we can see that none of them are running because we haven't set up XOA to auto start. So we'll just have to start it manually through this interface before we can access it in a web browser. Alright, now we jumped ahead a little bit. You can see that we're back in the Xen Orchestra interface. We have 2 pools that are visible, one for each host that we've set up in our hypervisor. XCP-NG1 has got a little more usage because that's the one that's actually running XOA, which is our only VM at the moment. So now we want to take host number 2 and drag it into the XCP-NG1 pool. And this is how we do it. It's kind of a pain the first time you do it, but once you know where to look, it's fairly easy to grab it. It's going to take some time before it takes over its brain and forces it to act there. You can see now the number of hosts is going up. The number of storage types is going up. Pool RAM usage has changed. And then we go back to the pool listings. We only see the one pool existing there. You can see on the dashboard it's only showing one pool and it's showing 2 hosts. That's exactly what it should be showing. We go into examine. We can see that XCP-NG1 has the resources that it should. You see that some of these storage devices are not available quite yet. They're spinning up and you can see them activating right now. And now they're all showing green, so they're all available to this pool. Now the next thing we're going to look at is creating a simple VM, but before we do, I want to go over one of the most annoying stumbling blocks I ran into in this project. If you take a look at this screen here, you see this exclamation point by XOA status. This is the update section, and it keeps giving me errors. Now eventually I did manage to register the appliance, but after that, every time I tried to update XOA, I would get this error where I was unable to contact the updater, and that's on the developer backend. Now, until I managed to resolve this, which was completely at random, you just have to keep trying and hope they get their infrastructure together, I was completely unable to create a new VM. There's no explanation as to why. I just ran into bugs and logs that didn't help at all, but if you're trying to run XCP-NG at home and you run into a problem where you absolutely cannot create a new VM, make sure that your XOA appliance is updated. Alright, let's go over how to do this now. Now, creating a VM is the most basic and essential function of any hypervisor, so you would think naturally that the first step is to load your relevant ISOs of interest into a pre-built repository so that you can access them on your VMs later. Now, this is the most logical way to do it, and therefore you are wrong. In XCP-NG, that SR does not exist. You're going to have to create it. So you're going to shell or console into your primary host, whatever that is. In this case, I'm using the first one. I'm going to pick a directory, in this case /media/ISO. I'm going to create that directory, and that's it. This is the directory where our ISOs are going to live. Now, once I've created that directory in the Linux structure, I have to create the SR. Let's do that in Xen Orchestra. We're going to say, put this on the first host. Here's our name. It's going to be ISO. It's an ISO repository. You can see that I've already filled in some of these fields before because, believe me, I've done this a bunch of times. I'm not happy about it. And there's a few different choices here for ISO SR. VDISR is just for virtual disks. ISO is for ISOs only. We're going to choose local for now. And here we're going to enter the path. that we put our ISOs in that we created in the Linux structure, and now we're just going to create it. So now we can see our ISO SR. I have no idea why it's eating up 18 gigs. When I take a look at it in the directory structure, there's nothing there. This must be some sort of overhead that Xen Orchestra is imposing on it. So now you have an ISO repository. Well, how do you get images to it? Well, there's one good method that I found, and I'll show you this, and then also another alternative, which some people use. The first is that I would suggest that you get some sort of an SFTP client. Here I'm using FileZilla. Just enter the IP, the username, which is probably root, and your root password, port 22. Connect to it, and then you'll have the directory structure. You can go and find the directory that you defined as the ISO SR. In my case, it's /media/ISO. And then you can drag any number of your thousands of ISOs that you've never used directly in here to load up on a virtual machine. The second way is to simply go into the directory in the command line using an SSH client, and using whatever method that you get. In this case, the simplest way is to just use wget. Find the address of the ISO that you want and wget it into that directory. For some reason, this has been less successful for me. It may have something to do with the fact that Debian certificates are temporarily expired. So I would recommend that you use an SFTP client. I'd like to pause here briefly, just because I have to tell you that when I started this project, and it was a little while ago, what with COVID and everything, the first time I tried to figure out how to create an ISO repository, the instructions that I found on the XCP-NG wiki said that the best way to do this was to use an NFS or CIFS file system repository, which you can easily install on any standard Linux VM, which were great instructions if you knew how to create that VM in the first place, which you can't because you don't have an ISO repository. That's kind of indicative of how things went when I tried to do research in the XCP-NG and Xen Orchestra documentation during this project. Anyway, let's get back to my failures. So we've got our new ISO repository. We've got the ISO we want in it. Let's create a VM. So we'll just choose one of these new VM buttons, which is the only thing that's actually kind of easy to find in Xen Orchestra. We'll select the pool. We only have one, that's fine. Now, look at all these distributions in this template list. At first, I thought that these were actually included ISOs or links to set ISOs, but they're not. All they do is set up rather optimistic parameters for the different operating systems, like 2 gigs for Windows 10. Let's just choose other install media because they don't have a preset for Debian 11. We'll give it 1 vCPU and 1 gig of RAM, and then we'll look at the ISOs, and well, there's the guest tools, but there's nothing in our ISO repository. Why is that? Why is it like that? Let's go take a look at the storage. Here's our ISO. You see that it doesn't look like a whole lot's going on, so on a whim I hit rescan disk, and look, all of a sudden some space is taken up. Why do I have to manually rescan the ISO repository before I can use what's in it? I don't know. It's a mystery, but let's try this again. We select other install media, we give it a name, we describe it, we set it up with the correct resources, and look, there's our ISO. It actually appeared. Now, when we choose a disk, this time let's try and create it on the second host, XCP-NG2. Since we're already using XCP-NG1 for the Xen Orchestra VM. So this seems to make sense. Let's give it a 20 gig hard drive, and let's try to create it. And what we get is a non-running VM that we can't start. Why is this? I don't know. We keep getting this sort of start error here, no host available. It never seems to turn on. Here's something else that's annoying. When we want to look at the total list of VMs, we have to clear the filters in order to see the ones that aren't running. So there we can see that it's not on. We can't start it. I don't know why. I looked into this for a while, and no one could come up with a good answer. This is just one of the very frustrating things about trying to work with Xen Orchestra and XCP-NG. Now, I think it may have something to do with the fact that my local SR is on host number 1, and that it's not shared. If so, that's a pretty big oversight, but we're going to try this again and create the thing on server 1 and see what happens. I will say this for XOA, after it throws you a bunch of unidentifiable errors and makes it hard to boot your VM, at least it makes it easy to delete it. Alright, so now we're going to go through exactly the same process again. The only differences are that we're going to build it on host number 1 because, I don't know, why not? That's the one where the ISO repository is, although it shouldn't matter. And we're going to give it a better description. And let's see what happens this time. And it starts out red and goes right to yellow, which is pretty encouraging. It's further than we got last time. And we have actually a percentage on the VM start, so I think it's going to work this time. It looks like it powered up. Okay, let's just tab over to the console. This console is not quite as responsive as the one that comes with, say, ESXi or Proxmox VE, but it's serviceable, and to be honest, you really shouldn't be using the built-in console all that often anyway. You should be using an RDP session or something similar, like a tight VNC. But it looks like we've successfully gotten to the installation procedure. Let's just complete this just to make sure it works. I'm going to let DHCP take care of my addressing this time. I usually don't do that for servers, but there's a reason to this time. I'm going to let it auto-assign, and I just want to make sure that if we can successfully migrate it to the other host, that it retains its address. And that shouldn't really be a problem. That's more of a function of the NIC and my home router, which is running this network. But you never know. We've seen some pretty strange stuff. So once I managed to get past the initial problems we had just getting the VM properly installed on a host, I really didn't have any other issues inside the VM itself. There were no oddities having to do with the network card emulation or the memory allocation. Everything just went about as I expected. So after finishing the installation, it went through another unnecessarily long reboot, and I know that I'm giving XCP-NG a lot of guff about taking a long time with processes that I don't think should take that long. It might not be its fault. Maybe it's just an oddity of running it nested inside the ESXi hypervisor. But as long as I had the time, I decided to go take a look around some of the information screens regarding this VM. So as you can see, we have a fairly granular monitoring of the activities on this VM, including some snapshot control. It's a little outside the scope of this particular project. Some pretty good advanced controls here. And a real-time resource monitor, which is a little better than the one that actually comes on the console page, although I do appreciate having it on the console page. So here I just did an IP add to see what the DHCP server assigned to us. Looks like address 177. I'm still a little salty about changing ISPs and losing IPv6 native, but what are you going to do? So naturally, being the responsible administrator that I am, just about the first thing I'm going to do is attempt to hot migrate this VM just to see what happens. There's this little convenient button up here which allows you to migrate VMs. We're going to send this one over to XCP-NG2, which is where it should be living, since that one has more free resources. You can select a migration network. If you're used to large hypervisors like XCP-NG, you'll know that sometimes you'll have a separate VLAN or a completely separate fiber network that's specifically for moving VMs and servers around just so it doesn't impact the rest of your network. We didn't set it up that way because it's, again, kind of outside of our scope. So while we're waiting for this migration to complete, let's just foolishly click around a bunch of other tabs and not pay attention. So, of course, while we're looking away, all of a sudden the pending tasks went to 0, which implies that, yes, the migration is done, the server status is green, and it looks like it just powered itself up. So, yeah, there's no hot migration. It's going to power itself off anyway. Now, let's just boot it and see what happens. And after we finally get through the boot process and grub loads our VM, we can take a look at our address and see that, yep, we're back at 177 just the way we're supposed to be. And from here, you can perform any number of other tasks that you would expect a hypervisor to perform, and for the most part, they worked about as I expected once I got to this point. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I've really been picking on XCP-NG and Xen Orchestra for a while, but there must be something to this hypervisor and control system, or it wouldn't be used by clients like Amazon Web Services. So there are some things that XCP-NG has going for it that fall outside of the scope of this test, and honestly outside of the scope of any undergraduate class, because to my knowledge, most colleges don't have massive sprawling distributed data centers and compute nodes across the United States. So purely theoretically, these are some of the advantages of XCP-ng and in general the Xen hypervisor that I found while doing my research. The first is environments using thin client deployment. I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but I remember back in the 90s, Citrix being used very heavily for thin client environments. That's where almost all of your desktop functions are actually farmed out to a server. They're not terribly common today, but they still are used in a lot of areas, and Citrix is still the go-to management system for these environments. The second case where Xen really has an advantage is in handling very large arrays of resources. For example, vSphere 6.7 has an upper limit of 768 logical CPUs per host, which seems like a lot, but in Xen, the limit is 4,095 logical CPUs per host, and there's no storage limit, whereas in vSphere, the storage limits are file system dependent. Xen hypervisors also have no hard limits on the number of VMs running, while, for example, ESXi 6.7's limit is 1,024. And as I think I touched on before, Xen Orchestra's options and the way the management plane is set up really make it clear the separation of the management tools in Orchestra from the hypervisor is set up in such a way to make it easier to manage very large compute pools and multiple very large compute pools with no consideration for co-location. Kind of along the same lines, Xen and XCP-ng have much more advanced SAN and vSAN storage features, including better multipathing. These things are important when your storage pool is serving a very large number of potential clients simultaneously. And finally, especially since you're dealing with extremely large enterprise pools that may be located all over the country, the cost of Xen, while it's difficult to pin down because these companies like to negotiate on a client-by-client basis, most of the reports from the vendors that I talk to in various fora indicate that the Xen lines are considerably cheaper to deploy than VMware, and XCP-ng is much less expensive in turn than Citrix Xen server. So those are some quite significant advantages when you're considering hypervisor use when you're a purchasing agent for a large company, but not so much for classroom labs or a typical home lab tinkerer. In those situations, the disadvantages really kind of came through for me. And let's go over them very, very quickly. First is the paywalled features in the management plane. A lot of these features were locked behind subscription levels of Xen Orchestra, and the subscriptions are not cheap for a student or a hobbyist. Now, if you do build from source and manually enable the missing features in Xen Orchestra, then you'll get this functionality for free, but after doing a little bit of research on this topic, it appears to be kind of difficult, and naturally you get no support whatsoever. Now, also because I was using the standard deployment of Xen Orchestra without a paid subscription, I was constantly bombarded with subscription requests, which was pretty annoying, and that's not something that I'm going to put up with in my own home lab. Now, one of the worst things I ran into were the installation problems. Now, over 2 days of this project were dedicated solely to getting a working installation of XCP-ng, and I did use the documentation quite extensively. It was no help at all. And this leads into the next problem. Part of the reason for those installation problems were back-end server issues, and by this I mean registration servers run by XCP-ng and XOA. It took over a day to confirm my account so I could register my installation of XOA due to server issues, and during that day I could literally not do anything. Kind of a minor quibble, but as long as I'm quibbling, I could point this out. The console performance is not as stable or fast as ESXi's or Proxmox VEs, and that's kind of a problem if you occasionally do use the console like I do to manage your VMs. And finally, there's the lack of real support for turnkey or pre-configured VM imports. There is an option to do it. I wasn't really successful in using it too much. I would say that if you are using XCP-ng as your hypervisor, you may as well just forget about this, and any servers that you need, do not use prefabs or simple container deployables. Just build the thing from the ground up. Now, this is in stark contrast to, say, using ESXi, which has a great number of these VMs available just because the hypervisor is so popular, so everyone builds for it. Or at the extreme end, a hypervisor like Proxmox VE, where you literally have a built-in menu of downloadable containers and VMs for you to try out at the click of a button. So overall, what do I think of XCP-ng and Xen Orchestra for use as a home lab or a classroom hypervisor? Well, it's not something that I would personally recommend to someone looking to use it as a primary hypervisor for a curriculum around virtualization. It's okay to touch on it. I think it's definitely worth at least learning, especially if you're specifically entering a job market where XCP-ng, Xen, or Citrix are in a certain amount of demand, because you're going to have to use it anyway. And if, for some reason, you are administering an extremely large array of very large VMs distributed across a lot of resource pools, it's simply one of the only tools that can really handle distributed networks like this. And if that's the sort of position that you're looking at, or the sort of thing that's in high demand in your area, then yes, you should absolutely learn XCP-ng, Xen, Citrix, just the same as you would learn any tool that's in high demand in your area or in your job market. For home labbers specifically, I would actually steer you towards either ESXi or Proxmox VE. ESXi, they do offer a free tier, which has some limitations, like a maximum of 8 CPUs per VM. You can't use vCenter, which honestly, if you're running one host, is not that big a deal. If you want those extra features, you don't need to get a super expensive license. You can join the VMUG, VMUG, which I believe is the VMware Users Group. They offer an evaluation tier at about $200 a year, which gives you basically all the licenses that you would ever need in order to run your home lab successfully. Proxmox VE, of course, has no licensing requirements. You may have to fiddle a little bit with your sources list, which is not that big a deal. And honestly, if you want to get anywhere in the world of Linux, you're going to have to learn how to do things like edit your sources list. I personally prefer ESXi, but I've worked with both, and I think they're both perfectly serviceable. One of the reasons that I went with ESXi is that my host, the Dell R720 PowerEdge series, has pre-configured distributions, so I don't have to mess around a lot with customizations before I install the image, and I've been perfectly happy with it. But again, this has all just been my opinion based on my experiences and studies based on this installation and test of XCP-ng and the Xen Orchestra management tool. I hope that you found it helpful. Maybe you have some differing opinions. That's fine. If you have any questions about whether this is a decent tool for you to install and learn, you can drop them in the comments if you want, or best of all, just install it yourself, because labbing is almost always the answer. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you later.